here's the first in what I think might be a new series of silly little videos, which I'm going to call Storytime, the stories behind the songs, and particularly the stories of how some of the songs on the record, Silent Spike, came to be. How did they come to be? The idea is to make it kind of more low-key, discursive, unedited, all that good stuff. And I want to start today with the first song on the record. And the title of today's program is How the First Song Became the Last Song. From the time that I realized that Silent Spike was going to be what it was, i.e. a cycle of songs all about the experience of the Chinese railway workers, I kind of knew the outline. And I knew that the story would begin with the Voyage, with the song that opens the record. But it was also the Voyage that was the last song to get finished. And there was a whole bunch of reasons for this. A lot of it is just sort of creative luck or impetus from outside sources. So sometimes you have a reason to finish a song first, perhaps as an opportunity to play it with a particular group or on a particular gig or something. And a song like The Voyage, which in its final form is close to 17 minutes long, is not one that's going to easily fit on a Monday Night Jam session set. So in that sense, probably it was always going to be one that kept getting pushed back. But also there were other challenges for me. A song like Deadline Creek, even at 22 minutes, is based on a very specific event. And I'd done the research, to really understand the timeline. There were plenty of bits and pieces of historical evidence like names, places, dates that I could use to fill in the storytelling aspect. Whereas The Voyage is kind of an archetype. It's a song that, there's no one particular sailing that it could hope to retell, but it's just an imagined journey from China to the west coast of the United States. So in that sense, I had a lot less sort of concrete material to work with. We started working on the album in the studio in April of 2024. Some of the songs that we recorded that week were ones that we'd done live a whole bunch of times, like Sundown Town. Others were fairly recently finished. I'd finished writing Gather the Ghosts and Bones just a week or two before those sessions, but the band tracks that we recorded at those sessions were ones that we lived with for a while. We came back a few months later in July, and some songs had come a long way in the meantime, and others hadn't, but we managed to get Deadline Creek down in July. And so we were closing in on having a full record with just two songs left to do, Steel Stretcher and The Voyage, which are the first two songs on the album, and the ones that were giving me the most trouble. And again, I think Steel Stretcher, while it's a short song and much more concise, is again, it's general impressions of a period and a set of experiences, as opposed to telling a specific story about a specific incident like the Lily White mine disaster or the Deadline Creek massacre. And so in that sense, yeah, it also gave me a bit more trouble, but at least there were specific details in the descriptions of how the railroads were built that gave me some lyrical ideas, some phrases, or just like magic words that I could work with. So we came back in September of 2024, planning to record those last two songs. Now, in this case, we had two songs that we'd never played before live, and that was a very different dynamic than the previous songs which we had recorded. Things like Ride the Rails and Sundown Town, we'd done lots and lots and lots of times live. Lily White and Gather the Ghost, those are both, mostly on my shoulders anyway, and I'd done them live a few times, and so it was just kind of a matter of getting an arrangement worked out for Lily White, and the rest on Gather the Ghosts and Bones is mostly me and Suzanne, really, with violin and cello parts. But Steel Stretcher and The Voyage were both new, and they were both giving me some trouble. But by the time we got to September, I felt like Steel Stretcher was there, I had the words, had the music, I had the concept and the arrangement, and the Voyage, well, it was almost there. But what we didn't have time for was, to live with the song and do it a few times, rehearse it, work it out. Now, Joe and Steve are incredibly fast. So in fact, when we went into the studio to do Steel Stretcher, they had it perfect, after a couple of run-throughs. Like all the band tracks on the album, what you hear on the record is a trio guide track that's all three of us playing through beginning to end, basically unedited. Lots of mixing and sound tweaking and stuff, but basically the fundamental tracks of the three of us were recorded live. But we did several takes, as we do with these things. Steel Stretcher was interesting because it's so motoric that it was one that we did initially with a click. And that certainly helped us iron things out. There's also a lot of silences in the opening of the piece. So we did it by the second or third time through with the click. It was fine. It was really good. But then Andrew Smiley, our producer, engineer, very wisely said, hey, why don't we try one without the click? And so we did actually two without the click, and that's what you hear on the record. It was just funkier and more vibey. Anyway, I digress, but that's the point of these videos, is that I'm not limited to 90 seconds. So here we go for the recording day to supposedly record Steel Stretcher and the Voyage. I had been feeling not great over the summer and really tired. We had a vacation to America in August, which was an absolute blast, but I came back and I felt like I couldn't shake the jet lag at all. No matter what. And then the morning of the sessions in September, I woke up to a familiar and unpleasant feeling. So back up 25 or so years, when I was teaching at Eastern Oregon University in La Grande, I had a La Grande, which features on the album. I'd had an episode of what they call atrial fibrillation. I was only 33 at the time. It was bloody scary. I spent a couple days in the hospital, lots of tests. It eventually reverted, and I'd only had a couple of subsequent episodes, none of which were as serious as the one that landed me in the hospital. But I woke up that morning and thought, oh God, it's back. And it had been the first time maybe in 14, 15 years that I had that feeling, but it's not a feeling you forget. So I got to the sessions early, as I tended to, and I just gave Andrew a little heads up that I wasn't feeling great, and if I needed to sort of excuse myself for a little break or something, that was what was going on. And he's such a supportive guy, and I knew I was in safe hands there. But the upshot was, by the time we got to the Voyage in the afternoon, having recorded Steel Stretcher, I was gone. I couldn't concentrate anymore, and the heart rate stuff was making me crazy. I felt like, I just couldn't focus, couldn't really play. And of course, in those situations, especially with a new song, you can't just play. I'm the writer, so it's playing, cueing, guiding, all of that kind of stuff. And when you're having trouble counting to 8, it's going to be hard to give anyone else a cue. And bless him, Joe Hoskin, our bass player, who's a dear friend, an amazing guy, he kind of stepped in and rescued me. He very sweetly said something along the lines of, hey, I think we could go a lot deeper with this song. We don't have enough time today. Let's just leave it for next time. But the fact was, I just wasn't physically up to it at that moment. And that was fine too. We all knew that we didn't want to do a half-assed job. So by the day after those sessions, the heart rate thing was feeling a bit better, but I still felt gross and bad. So I went to see the GP and told him that I'd had a recurrence of AFib. And he did do a heart rhythm test, which I knew was going to be negative. but he was more dismissive than that. He's like, oh, there's no way you had atrial fibrillation when you were 33. It just doesn't happen. No one gets it that young. You must have been misdiagnosed. Not like been in a proper hospital. I have medical records. I've got the scan results. All that stuff happened. It existed. I felt very gaslighted at the moment he said that. And his basic take was, I was working too hard and I was too stressed out, and, try to relax and maybe take a beta blocker to kind of like lower your stress levels and all of that. But, yes, I was stressed, but, you kind of know when you physically don't feel like yourself. So that was kind of a missed opportunity to sort of slow this already, intensifying march towards catastrophe that I maybe was starting to sense was happening there. But, back to work, keep doing your stuff and keep working on the song. So that gave me time to work on the song a little bit further. And I think once I had the text, the lyrics worked out, part of what was giving me trouble, and which I hadn't in retrospect quite worked out at that point, was the balance of how much of the song there needed to be. In other words, like, how long did it really have to be? Was my idea of a sort of epic, was that like overstepping the mark for the amount of material that I had? Because to me, I just had this sort of hypnotic idea of, a pair of chords like the C coming in and out that would kind of unify the song. And, is that enough to justify an 8-minute long song, a 10-minute long song, a 16-minute long song? And, certainly there was a voice saying, no, it's not enough. And then you start looking for more material. And there were things too, like the middle section of the song, which depicts the ship kind of stranded in dead waters without wind at sea, where I couldn't really envision a melody for the lyrics. And eventually I was like, maybe this is, your brain telling you that this is narration rather than lyrics. And that's what I ended up doing. So, yeah, I mean, is that enough for a song? Well, I did have that. So it's a 4/4. But the song kept getting longer and longer. By the way, so you can tell, if you're a real nerd, that the Voyage and Steel Stretcher were written at basically the same time, because they're both built around what I call the rush chord. So if like, say your B minor bar chord here, yeah, but instead of the third, you lift your finger up so you've got a second. And then what Alex Lifeson always used to do was add a fourth below. So the fifth of the chord is in the bottom. And so that goes all the way through the Voyage. And it's also very much on purpose, like all through Steel Stretcher. In fact, some of it's even in the same key. So that's the middle section of Steel Stretcher, which just happens to be like crazy distorted and wacky and wild. So the weeks went by between September and October. We put another date in the diary to finish the recording, and I kept sort of hammering away at the material, mostly just kind of like, does there need to be more? And yet everything that I tried to add, things like bridge sections and transitions and stuff, it all just basically felt extraneous. It felt like it didn't fit. And everything else in the song really did fit. So I finally kind of decided I just had to trust the material, that it was going to be quite a simple, not exactly static, but, spacious song. And So we were all set to record it. We always tend to record on Tuesdays when possible because we often see each other jamming on Mondays, and then we can just kind of mosey from there over to the studio the next day. And so that Monday night, I was conducting an orchestra rehearsal at Cardiff University. I was filling in as a guest conductor for a term with the orchestra there. So as we were approaching that session, I mean, I've been working on the song, but I hadn't achieved nearly as much as I hoped because the fatigue I was experiencing was just like nothing I'd ever known. I mentioned earlier, I came back from vacation feeling like I had the worst case of jet lag ever. But in this case, it was like every day the jet lag would get worse. And the day before the sessions, I just about dragged my ass out of bed at noon or something like that. And had to leave for rehearsal at like 5:30 or something, 5, I think. And somewhere around 3:30, I was like, oh God, I gotta take a nap. This is crazy, And yeah, so had my little nap and made my way over to rehearsal, and then the shit started to hit the fan pretty fast. Working on Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony and Sibelius End Saga, and I started getting a really killer headache. So at first I was just annoyed, but by the time we got to the break, I was thinking, I don't think I'm going to make it to the jam session tonight. And so I called my son Sam, who was also going. I was like, "You go without me. I've got a migraine or something. I'm not going to make it tonight." 15 minutes later, in the break, I started feeling really crap, like thinking, "Do I have COVID? Am I food poisoned? What's going on?" And it quickly, like in a matter of just minutes, really got to the point where I went and found my host, one of the professors at the university, and said, "Rob, I'm not up to it. Can you cover the rest of the rehearsal for me? I think I need to just go home and get some sleep." And he was super understanding. So I called Suzanne. I called Suzanne to say I was on my way home. I left. I took a few steps out of the front of the building, and I just about collapsed. I really couldn't walk, and I realized that trying to drive myself home was a terrible idea. So I kind of stumbled back into the building. I felt by this point dizzy and nauseous and short of breath. So I called Suzanne, my wife, and said, "Hey, sweetheart, how I said I was coming home? Well, I can't get home. Can you come pick me up? And we'll get the car tomorrow." And so she headed out. And the security guy, whose name was Bob, he just like amazing dude, nicest, most helpful guy you can imagine. With a lot of guys in that role, they can seem a bit brusque and no bullshit when you encounter them in the routine of their job, but when circumstances call for action, they're amazing. And he was incredible. And so he very sweetly offered to give me some water, which helped me just kind of calm down and settle things. But I just kept feeling worse and worse. And he offered, to call an ambulance for me. I was like, "Oh, don't be ridiculous. No, my wife's just coming. She'll take me home. I'll get a good night's rest. And, it's probably just onset of COVID or something." A few minutes later, I was like, "Bob, about that ambulance, I think you better call him." And he did. And they said, "Yeah, okay. It'll be about a 5-hour delay." And shit, man, 5-hour delay. So I thought, well, okay, Suzanne's coming to get me. We just forget the ambulance. And I still wasn't sure if I needed to go to the hospital or not. And I hadn't told Suzanne one way or the other. But by the time she got there, I realized I really needed to go to the hospital. So Bob and Susie helped me get out to the car, and I got in the front seat of the car, closed the door, and said, "We've got to go straight to the emergency room." And, long story short, first of all, I was lucky to be alive because turned out I was having a heart attack, and quite a nasty one, too. Not that there are unnasty heart attacks, but yeah, it was kicking my ass. But the NHS saved my life. They put a stent in me, and that was amazing because one minute you're literally like dying. I mean, this is the thing about a heart attack that I keep trying to find ways to explain, is that, it's not necessarily the most painful thing that ever happened to me. I think probably slipped disc was the most acutely physically agonizing thing I've ever felt. But it's different because it's not that you're hurting, it's that you're dying. I mean, your heart muscle is literally dying, and then, your brain's going to start to go, everything's going to start to go. And I was at least very aware that what was happening to me was different than any other kind of medical situation I'd ever experienced before. And that, at that moment I sort of realized death isn't a moment, it's a process. And it had started, and I was, man, it was heavy. It was really heavy. And I remember the surgeon saying, once we put the stent in, you should start to feel better pretty soon. And it was, a medical miracle, that within minutes of that stent going in, suddenly, I felt better than I had in weeks, months even, because of course, that artery had been blocked almost completely for God knows how long. And so once that was opened up, I started to feel a lot better. But it left me in the position of being like, oh, well, what about the recording session tomorrow? I guess that's all. So I sent one of the strangest texts I've ever had to send in my life. Hey guys, really sorry about this. I had a heart attack and I'm alive. It's fine, no big deal. But the recording session tomorrow is canceled. And that felt really weird because, it's like this weird mixture of like life and death shit and really mundane kind of stuff. Not that recordings are mundane, but just that daily to and fro of like, what time are we rehearsing? Where are we meeting? Suddenly you're back in that while you're in the most acute care room in the cardiac ward of the hospital. But they were all, amazing, so supportive and kind. So, so we bagged that recording session. And, I kind of thought, I knew I was going to be more or less off work for a while, and friends who had heart attacks, especially guys who'd had them youngish like me, all warned me that, it was going to take time. The best advice I got was that, don't be fooled by the euphoria that comes from getting a stent, because yes, you're going to feel almost invincible because suddenly your heart is getting blood at a normal level for the first time in ages. But, there's damage in there from the heart attack itself, and it's going to take a long time to heal up. So, I suppose in some ways I kind of thought, I'll be off work for a while, so that'll give me time to work on the record, quietly at home in a kind of stress-free, chilled-out way. Whenever I've got some time, I can do some overdubbing or some mixing or some editing or whatever. That was a completely unrealistic expectation, especially for the first 6 weeks or so. I just couldn't summon up the energy to do anything really creative. I played a little bit of guitar and piano here and there, but even that, like, it just, there's this deep fatigue and emptiness as a result of what had happened that would, either I couldn't work up the enthusiasm to attempt it or couldn't do it well, whatever. So the weeks kind of went by, and it was sort of like time had frozen. I wasn't progressing the songs. I wasn't finding new inspiration or whatever. And I still felt like, in the case of the Voyage, like it was very much a work in progress. Well, gradually I started to feel a bit better and get my mojo back and start to think, I really want to get this record done and out the door. I'd already hoped to have finished it like 6 months before this. And for a variety of reasons, we kept pushing it back until heart attack week when I'd hoped to have the tracking finished. And sometime, during this lull, I got to thinking, when we should put this record out is the 4th of July. So that kind of gave me a deadline to work towards. But that meant, we had to probably track the Voyage in March at the very, very latest, or we just wouldn't have time to turn it all around, because it takes weeks to get things, uploaded and approved and stuff out to the press and all that crap. Never mind, the complexity of putting the song together. So this kind of put me in the funny position of, having to schedule the recording session as soon as I could imagine physically being able to do it. And that meant, again, we were in the position of having not lived with it as a group in any meaningful way. We hadn't taken it out on gigs. We hadn't had any more rehearsals since the heart attack, all of that kind of stuff. And so, the last memory that anyone had was, of us kind of hacking through it in September when I was really sick and out of it. And where the concept of the song was probably a little unfinished. But we all agreed that we needed to, get on and get it done if we were ever going to have a record. And so for me, it was sort of trying not to freak out and, convince myself that we were working with an inadequate song. Because I knew it was going to be, it's the first song on the record. It was going to be really important. So we got into the sessions at long last and got to recording it. And because it's such a long and complicated song, and it really needs things like some guitar changes and stuff, it's essentially 3 songs spliced together, maybe 2 songs spliced together. In other words, where we needed to do a join or a big instrumental change or something in the basic track, then we sort of stopped and regrouped. And so we got it done. I mean, long story short, and there's a lot to say about the song musically and how we put it together. But we got the basic tracks done. And I took it home and listened to it, and I was like, man, this is just 16 minutes of next to nothing. Is this really gonna work? And but this was the thing. I probably very nearly chickened out. I was ready to get the scissors out and start cutting the song way back and thinking, if I can get it down to 7-8 minutes, I think it'll be a lot more bearable for people. And I credit Andrew and Sam, producer and son, for talking me out of that. They talked me back and said, look, just finish it the way you conceived it, full length. And, once it's finished, if we think it sucks or if it's boring or whatever, then we can cut it. So I got to work on it. I was somewhat encouraged, and it's something I think about a lot, that sometimes if you want to do something epic and complex, you need a really simple framework for it. I mean, there's a really good reason, for instance, that as John Coltrane's vision of what improvisation could be evolved and became deeper and more spiritual and more personal, he stepped back from really hyper complex chord structures. So, he went from giant steps back to playing modally, and that gave him a lot more improvisational flexibility. It gave him a chance to build large emotional arcs that really went somewhere, and that's something I really wanted to do on the 2 longer songs on this record. And I wanted the 2 longer songs to be really different from each other. Deadline Creek is basically one take, all of us playing live, and it's just the trio. There's no overdubs or anything like that. Whereas I knew that the Voyage, in order to have this sort of cinematic grandeur to it, I wanted it to be very much like a studio piece of the kind that, I grew up loving. You think about tracks like the Prophet song by Queen, or March of the Black Queen off of Queen 2, and the big Rush epics, There's certainly some influence of tunes like Xanadu in the Voyage, and just that sense of using the studio to allow you to orchestrate and create colors. And so it went from being a very simple basic track to being a very complicated recording. Complicated, that's maybe not the right word, but very richly developed, I think, because over the next few weeks, as I started to feel physically better and better, suddenly it's sort of like at each stage, as I sort of accepted what I had to work with and did what I thought I needed to within that, I sort of felt more and more confident with where the song was going and what, it was shaping up to be, which was, a really simple, really big structure, but really developed in terms of colors and dynamics and sounds and stuff. And so the gist of it became, it's sort of a studio showcase for the electric guitar. And again, that's a very sort of Queen, Boston, Jimmy Page kind of thing. It's got the most overt sort of Brian May love letter of any of the things I've ever recorded in it. But it's all kind of there to tell the story of this journey across the ocean, starting from sunrise and setting sail on the sea, sort of very long opening 4-minute introduction through the first part of the journey, what it feels like to be at sea, to be traveling, to be going somewhere with purpose and intent. And then this middle section, which is, the dangers of the sea, whether it's, becoming essentially, frozen on calm seas or tossed about by the storm, and then the elation of escaping the storm and returning to the voyage. And then the song sort of trails off as you begin to reach the shores, and it's very purposefully organized so that it segues as shockingly as we could make it straight into Steel Stretcher. As if, this dream of an ocean journey, you suddenly become wide awake when the steel hits the steel on the first day on the railroad. So yeah, that was kind of the arc of it, is that it became, what classical nerds might call as much an orchestration and arranging challenge as it was a composing and writing challenge. Very few words, very few chords, lots of developing of ideas and developing and laying out of musical ideas that would be there for the rest of the disc, which, I'd gone to some trouble to make sure that there were musical themes that would appear in every song in different ways. Just like I sort of mentioned the rush chord reappearing in Steel Stretcher. There's lots of melodic things, other chord progressions, stuff like that appear for the first time in the Voyage and get developed and returned to, and hopefully give the whole album like a sense of a journey in time as well as in space. So anyway, I hope that's interesting, and glad to say I've been keeping out of the hospital for a good many months now and feeling pretty good. And nothing's as good for the heart as finishing a record and getting the goddamn thing out the door. So have a listen to The Voyage, streaming links below in the description, as they say. And, if you feel like you could maybe like and subscribe here, that'd be really cool. Follow us on your favorite streaming site, whatever that is. Copies of the physical CD are available on our website, guitar.kennethwoods.net, in the store section. At the moment, you can only order them directly from us, but they're, in my opinion, they're really beautiful. The manufacturer did a great job making them really look like something. So yeah, More to come. We'll be talking about the stories of how the other songs came to be, and maybe breaking down a little bit more of the music stuff for those of you who like to geek out with these things. But this was, you know, of all the things I've ever been involved in writing or creating, certainly the most dramatic and challenging. I mean, you know, one doesn't generally think of composition as a life or death process, but in this case, it came very close. And the upshot of which is that I love the song now. I'm quite happy with it, and hope you love it too. Thanks for listening.